That cool fall weather is here, and that means it's time to divide my daylilies. Now, I have daylilies in several areas of my landscape, and they are the most carefree plant I have. They grow in clay, and they grow in sand, and they grow in loam, and they like the sun, but they can take some shade, and they don't really need a lot of help from me in order to bloom and bloom and bloom. But there are two things that are very important. If you want lots of blooms on your daylily, you need to snip off those blooms as soon as they start to be spent. Because if you don't snip it, it goes to seed and it stops blooming. And you do that in the spring while they're blooming. The second thing you need to do is occasionally you're going to have to divide them, because they grow in bigger and bigger clumps and they run out of room for their roots in the middle of those clumps. So if you don't occasionally dig them up and divide them, that clump will start to dwindle because it's run out of growing space. And you do that in the fall. If a plant blooms in the spring, you divide it in the fall. That's the best time. And so I've dug up a clump for you, and you can tell that this clump is growing in sand, partly because of the color of the soil, but partly because of how thin the roots are. When they are in a dry environment, the roots tend to be very thin. And when they are in a more moist environment, the roots get bigger and fatter. If you happen to have rich, fertile, loamy soil, then your daylilies are just going to kind of fall apart in that rich soil. But most of us deal with sand and clay and other kinds of difficulties in the soil, and if that's your situation, you just want to carefully work at it until you can get the roots to divide a little bit. And you're going to break some of them, that's going to happen, but you don't want to break it if you don't have to. So once you've got the soil away from the roots of the plant, you can just kind of pull them out like that. So there are two of them here, and I could leave them together, or I could, actually there's three. This is a great example of how the daylily spreads. So this is the mother plant, and it has a rhizome that comes out to the side, and a rhizome is just a stem that grows underground and it produces another plant. So we have the baby plant here attached to the mother plant. And as long as this little baby plant has roots of its own, you can easily just snip off that rhizome, separate them, and you have two plants ready to go back in the ground. Now, once you've got them out of the ground, you want to do a little bit of pruning. You want to take off the bottom part of the root because you've been breaking it apart, and it's better to have a clean cut than a rough break. And the other thing you can do is prune the greenery. You don't want to take the greenery off because that's how it gets nutrients. In the fall, the plant is storing nutrients for the spring. But you do want to have enough of it off so that it's not going to be wilty. And if you've got dead pieces, go ahead and pull those dead pieces off, because that's just a place that can attract bacteria and cause problems for your plant. And so this one is ready to either go back in the ground or to be stored for a few weeks, and either one of those options are fine. If you want to store the plant, you can do that for 2 to 3 weeks, sometimes a little bit longer, but it's important to keep the roots moist. So this one has been pruned, it has been cleaned up, and it's ready to either go back into the ground or to be placed into a bag for storage for a few weeks. And so if you're planting it, you always want to have a mound of dirt. You want to bring it up into a nice little mountain, and you want to situate your plant on that mountain so that the roots drape down the hill. And then you cover up the roots from there when you're planting it in the ground. And you can see from the crown of the plant this white part can be under the soil. So I could actually plant it with the soil level about right here. You can really see when it starts to turn green, that's where it was above the soil, and the white part is the part that was below the soil. So if I wanted to, say, give this one to a friend, I could make that little mound in my soil pot and drape out those roots. And then just gently put some soil over the top. And I could begin watering this plant and it would be ready to share. And if some of the white part is above the soil, it will be fine. It will green up and it will continue to grow just fine. You need to have enough of it under the soil that it supports itself very well. So you would plant it this way in a pot or in the ground. It's the same procedure. But let's say that you needed to store them for a few weeks before you put them in the ground. Daylilies can be stored as a bare root, and if you buy them from mail order companies, they come as a bare root. If you wanted to store this as a dry root, it's fairly easy to do that. It's important to know that that can't be done over a long period of time. It's only good for 2 to 3 weeks, maybe a little bit longer, but as these roots dry out, they lose their viability. So if you're preparing to store them for just a bit, you need to do that carefully. And you want to do that by pruning the roots. You just want to get the rough edges off. You want to have about as much root as you do greenery on the top of the plant. You want it to be about equal, like that. And I do that in a Ziploc bag, and I put my plant in the bag. I put the roots of the plant in the bag, and I add cedar shavings. And I use cedar, number one, because it repels insects, and number two, it's not going to deteriorate over time in this little storage container. And I want to cover the roots so that they're not just exposed to the air. And I'm going to mist this with water because it needs to be damp. Not dripping, but damp. So there's going to be quite a bit of water. It's going to be quite a bit moist. You'll see that the cedar shavings will change to a little bit redder shade of color, but you won't be able to see water beating up on the bottom of the bag. It needs to be moist, but not wet. And once you have it in that situation, you don't want to seal it, but you can close the bag up a little bit so it will retain that moisture. And you want to put it in a cool, dry place like a garage. It can be as cold as 40 degrees, but definitely not colder than that. And it can stay in this situation for 2 to 3 weeks while you either prepare a bed to plant it in or take it to give them away to friends or whatever you're going to do with your daylilies. And so this is how you can care for them temporarily while you're transplanting them. And what you would want to do is just continue to divide the clump. And you don't have to take it down to one plant. If you wanted to use, say, this top part of the clump here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 lilies in this top clump. And I could leave those 5 lilies together. And when it blooms next year, it's going to be a nice full plant and it'll have lots of daylilies coming off of it, but it still has room to grow. So you can plant them in clusters of small groups, or you can plant them individually and space them out a little bit farther. And that just gives you more time before you have to divide them up again. So you'll have several years before you need to dig them up and divide them. So that's what you need to know about daylilies. When you get them back in the ground in the fall, you'll want to give them a little bit of fertilizer because they are continuing to grow and they're still producing energy for the next year. And in the fall, in the winter, they'll lose their leaves to the ground, and then in the spring, they're going to pop back out and you're going to have some gorgeous daylilies in the spring. So I hope I've taught you something new. I hope you get out there and divide your daylilies so you'll be ready for them to come back next year. Consider liking and subscribing and share with your friends. And I'll see you next time on The Handcrafted Garden.